Good morning, YouTubers. This is Tony, and today we're going to show you the location of and how to replace your crank sensor on your 2004 Subaru Legacy 2.5 liter motor. The crank sensor is located just below the alternator. There's your alternator on the front of the car. You can see it down in there with the little orange dot. That's your crank sensor. The crank sensor is secured by a 10mm bolt, but in order to get to the crank sensor safely, you'll need to remove the alternator. So I'm going to cover the steps and what you'll need to do to remove the alternator. The first thing you'll need to do is remove this metal cover. There's a 10mm bolt here, one there, and one there. And then you'll need to remove this 12mm bolt. Be mindful that on the other side of this 12mm bolt, there is a nut. There it is right there. You'll need to remove that, otherwise when you turn this, it will just spin. So let's do that first. Okay guys, I've removed the metal cover. The next thing you want to do is disconnect the negative side battery terminal. Anytime you're working on any electronic components within your vehicle, it's always a good idea to disconnect the negative side battery terminal to keep from shorting anything out. So the next thing you'll need to do is remove this bolt fully. You'll need to break this nut loose. You'll need to loosen this nut, which takes the tension off of the belt, and then you can safely remove the alternator. So again, you want to break this nut, but don't take it out all the way just yet. Let it sit in there. You want to break this nut down there, and then you want to loosen this nut to take the tension off the belt, and then remove the belt. And then you can safely remove the alternator. So let's do that next. Okay guys, I removed the alternator, as you see. Just set that to the side. There's your crank sensor. It is secured by a 10mm nut. What you want to do is take a long socket and a 10mm take a long driver and a 10mm socket, and you want to break that nut free. So let's do that. So you just want to break this nut free, guys. Oh, not quite loose yet. Be careful not to drop this nut, guys. There's your 10mm nut. Then what you can do is you can just grab the crank sensor, give it a couple wiggles, and pull it out. So there is your old crank sensor. I did miss one step, guys. What you want to do is take this electrical connector before you pull the crank sensor out. There's a little tab right there. Push that tab down and pull it away from the crank sensor. Then you can remove the crank sensor. I'm not replacing the crank sensor in this vehicle today, guys. I received a couple of emails from folks who are having crank sensor issues with their Subaru Legacy, and they did not know where the crank sensor was or how to get it out. So I decided to come see a friend and make this video with his car, just to show you guys where the crank sensor is and how to get it out. It's pretty easy, guys, for the most part. If you have small hands, you really don't need to take the alternator loose. You can just take a long screwdriver, and what you do is you would stick the screwdriver down to the crank sensor, put it on this tab, push it down, and then you can take your other hand or another long screwdriver and push the crank sensor connector off of the crank sensor, and then you can take a 10mm socket and a swivel, and you can go down there and try and get it out. I just find it to be so much more easier if I just remove the alternator, but that's another way of getting it if you don't want to remove the alternator. Otherwise, the best way is to remove the alternator. So what you would do next is you would take your crank sensor, your new crank sensor, and basically you're going to connect your crank sensor. Just push it in until it clicks. You are then going to put your crank sensor back down in a seated position. You are then going to reinstall your 10mm nut. Make sure you torque it down till it's snug. It doesn't have to be super tight, guys. The crank sensor is made of plastic, so remember, if you over tighten it, you can potentially crack the crank sensor. So you just want to turn it until it's snug, and then you're pretty much done. Remember, everything you did to take the alternator apart to get to the crank sensor, you want to put back together in the reverse order that you used to take it apart. If this is your first time doing something like this, I recommend that you snap photographs of everything before you take it apart. That way you will know where everything goes. So let's put the alternator and the belt back on, guys, and I'll be right back. The first thing you'll want to do, guys, is when you put your alternator back in, you want to put this bolt back in. You want to put this nut on the other side, but don't tighten it just yet. So let's do that. The next thing you want to do is put your belt around the pulleys, and then you can pull the alternator up. And then what you want to do is reinsert the nut here and just thread it, make it slightly tight but not over tighten it. And then what you want to do is you want to turn this nut until this pulley raises up the alternator and the belt is tight. So let's do that next. Okay, guys, now that I've reinserted that bolt there, what you want to do is you want to start turning this bolt, and what it's doing is it's putting tension back on the belt. This particular item in front of you is called the belt tensioner. You want to turn that until the belt is tight. You don't want to over tighten the belt, but you do want the belt to be tight. Now that the belt is tight, you can then tighten your lock nut. That prevents this from slipping and the belt becoming loose. So let's go ahead and tighten the lock nut. Okay, guys, now that I've tightened the lock nut, you just want to double check everything while you're here. You want to make sure that your crank sensor connector is in. You want to make sure that your belt is tight. You want to make sure that your tensioner screw is in correctly, and then the lock nut is tight so that the belt doesn't slip off. And remember that if you had a check engine code for your vehicle and you had to replace the crank sensor, you'll need a scan tool to reset the check engine light. If you don't have a scan tool, you can simply disconnect the negative side battery terminal from your car for about 25 minutes. That will automatically reset your check engine light. Then you should be able to start your car and drive with no problems. Again, you just want to do a dummy check before putting the metal cover back on. While you're here, now is a good time to inspect your alternator's electrical connector, you know, give that give that a look. Make sure that everything looks good. If you find any fault with the wiring or anything of that nature, now is a good time to replace this stuff. It's pretty easy to replace it. You want to make sure that your battery lead is on tight. You want to go ahead now and tighten this nut. And remember, on the back side, there's that other nut. You're going to need to put a wrench on that as you're tightening it. So let's do that. Okay, guys, I put the metal cover back on. The next thing you'll need to do is reconnect your negative side battery terminal. Then you should be able to start your car and drive with no problems. If the check engine light is on when you start the car, then simply disconnect the negative side battery terminal again for about 25 minutes. That will reset your check engine light. Or you can go into any advanced AutoZone or advanced auto parts. They have a scan tool and can reset your check engine light for you. Or you can go to any Walmart and purchase a scan tool for a fair price, or Harbor Freight. It's pretty easy, guys, for the most part. So let's do a dummy check and go over what I needed to do to get to your crank sensor. Remember, the crank sensor is located just below the alternator. What I did was I removed this 10mm nut here, this 10mm nut there, this 10mm nut there, this 12mm nut there. Remember, there's a nut back there that you need to put a wrench on to remove this bolt here. Once you remove the metal frame, I loosened this up but did not take it out because you're going to need to remove the alternator. On the belt tensioner, what I did was I broke the nut, the lock nut, and then I loosened the tensioner nut, which took tension off the belt. Then you can remove the belt. Then you can fully remove this bolt here after you remove the lock nut, and you can simply pull the alternator out of your way. And then there's your crank sensor, secured by a 10mm bolt. You simply just disconnect the electrical connector, compare your old crank sensor with your new crank sensor, put your new crank sensor in, bolt it down, reconnect your electrical connector, and then you want to put your alternator back in. Start this nut, but don't tighten it. Put your nut on the other side. You want to raise this up and put in your lock nut, but don't tighten it. Then you want to put the belt back on, and then you want to turn this adjuster nut until the belt is tight. Once the belt is tight, you can then tighten the lock nut. You can then fully tighten this bolt here, and then you're pretty much done. You just need to put all this stuff back on. And word of advice to you, before you put this piece on, you want to secure this nut, because once you put this piece on, you won't be able to get your socket in here to tighten that. So you want to tighten this nut first, make this your last piece that you put on, and then pretty much, guys, you're done. I hope the video helps. If you have any questions, please reach out. Thanks for watching.